Hello everybody, this is a lecture of political thought, and today we are going to talk about John Stuart Mill. We have already talked about Jeremy Bentham, who is considered the founder of utilitarianism, and Jeremy Bentham is another major thinker of the same tradition, but he's also a great critique of Jeremy Bentham's notion of utilitarianism. In John Stuart Mill's philosophy and thought, we will see some very important things, and the most important thing that we need to remember here is that in his thought he tries to reconciliate or bring together the ideals of rationalism, which were the ideals that guided Jeremy Bentham, and he also tried to club those ideals of rationalism with certain romantic ideals, certain ideals of romanticism. Now, since we've already talked about enlightenment and what are the basic notions that are derived from enlightenment, so we know that rationalism was a product of enlightenment and the rational thought prevailed for a long period of time, and it was majorly the influence on Jeremy Bentham, who was who saw everything rationally. And when I say rationally, we also need to understand rationalism goes hand in hand with scientific vigor, with empiricism, with objectivity, and these are the ideals that were there in Benthamian thought. And on the contrary to these ideals of rationalism, there was a movement in 18th century that was known as Romantic movement, and these romanticists or the Romantics, they countered the ideals of rationalism, and they asserted on the ideals of subjectivity, on individual diversity, how individuals are diverse, and how not everything can be judged on a single scale of scientific spirit. And this was the other influence on John Stuart Mill. Before going into the further details of his political thought, we'll just very briefly look at his life, what happened and how he was trained. The life history of John Stuart Mill is important because his father, James Mill, was an important friend of Jeremy Bentham, whom we know as the founder of utilitarianism, and his entire upbringing was on those ideals, on the ideals of Benthamian utilitarianism. And he was homeschooled. John Stuart Mill was homeschooled, and he was well trained and well ingrained in the ideals of Benthamian utilitarianism. And it was because of these initial training that he went through as a kid and as a student, that he developed certain ideals. He developed the notion that how nurture is more important than nature in shaping of an individual, and he also could appreciate the role of education in forming any child's or any student's or any person's intellectual makeup, and how education played a role in that, how the child is going to grow up and what he is going to become. So those things were there. But another very important thing that happened because of the influence of utilitarianism on Mill was that he went through a mental crisis around 1820s, and in that crisis he could not and in that crisis he was unable to feel certain things, and it is said that he lost his capacity for joy in life, and he could only recover that capacity to enjoy life and to have joy in life only through reading the works of romantic poetry by Coleridge and Wordsworth. And that is, I think, the turning point when he tried to reconcile the two ideals, the ideals of rationalism that he has been ingrained with since his very childhood, and the ideals of romanticism. So this is very briefly about his life. Now we'll come to the thought of John Stuart Mill. One very important thing that John Stuart Mill did was that he countered and he criticized the mechanical formula and mechanical formulation that Bentham had provided for calculating pleasure. Because if we remember from the last lecture, we know that Bentham gave a proper mathematical kind of a formula in which he told if we subtract the sum total of pain from pleasure, then we'll be able to get net pleasure, and every action should be governed on this particular equation, and which is something that he criticized, John Stuart Mill criticized. He claimed that the pleasures that are felt by various human beings and different pleasures that are felt by a single human being have a wide range of differentiation. Differentiation as in they are very varied. There's a diversity in the amount, consistency of pleasure, and those pleasures, the way they are felt with different individuals also vary vastly. So this is something that he asserted, and he asserted that all pleasures were not equal in value, and to prove his point, he argued that dissatisfaction of a learned scholar like Socrates is more important than satisfaction of a fool. So that is how he brought in the elements of qualitative aspects in the utilitarian ideology. So utilitarian ideology of Bentham was very quantitative, and the qualitative aspects were added through John Stuart Mill's formulation. Further ahead, he modified utilitarianism of Bentham on what grounds? On the grounds where he took into account factors like moral motives, sociability, that is the ability to socialize, friendships, and the emotions that are involved therein, feeling of universal altruism, it is the feeling of doing something selfless, and the idea of selflessness itself, sympathy, and a concept of justice. So these were the things that he brought in and he took into account to modify the idea of utilitarianism formulated by Jeremy Bentham. He argued that Bentham and Benthamite thought was negligent, that it neglected the individual character, the individual's every individual's specific character and diversity of various individuals, and in contrast, or to counter that negligence on the part of Benthamite thought, he argued that there should be a stress on feelings and imagination that should be put when we are talking about human emotions, when we are talking about a good life, when we are talking about a human life which is successful and happy. So these are the things that John Stuart Mill added to Benthamite thought. He also gave aspects on how human actions are determined, and he said that the human actions usually have three aspects: the moral aspect, which determines if the action is right or wrong; the aesthetic aspect, in which the beauty of the action is reflected; and the sympathetic aspect, in which that action's lovableness, or the action's how action is received by others, is also important. So these are various outline. This is the outline of John Stuart Mill's thought, and this is a brief overview of how he added to certain ideals of Benthamite thought. And now we're going to move ahead to the important part, that is the political philosophy of John Stuart Mill. And for him, again, when he's talking about political thought or political organization, he says that, and his ideals can be very beautifully put in his own words, within quotes: the sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their members is self-protection. So, unquote. So what is he doing here? He is limiting freedom of any individual when they are coming together, living in a society. Then an individual's freedom can only be curtailed on one ground, and that is self-protection. And according to Mill, what does that mean? In the negative sense, it means that the society has no right to coerce anybody, that is to force anybody, except for self-defense. So if any person is living in a society and he is not harming the life of any other individual in the society, then the society or any individual of that society cannot interfere with the exercise of freedom of that particular individual. Only interference can be made on behalf of the fear of self-preservation. If life is threatened, if somebody is being threatened on their life, then only force can be utilized on behalf of the society, on behalf of the government. This is the negative side, this is the extreme side that he is showing. On the positive side, what would this mean? This extreme amount of freedom that John Stuart Mill vouches for. On the positive side, it would mean that there would be the grant of largest freedom for every individual's pursuit. They can pursue creative mind, creative impulses, and they can do anything they want to for their self-development. So this is the basic ideal and basic notion that governs the political philosophy of John Stuart Mill. And he also asserts that in addition to right to freedom, there is attached, there is an attached right to choice that comes along with the right to freedom. And he also solely and wholeheartedly asserts for that right to choice to exist in a good democratic, in a good political setup. Further ahead, what was the system of government that should be there in an ideal political setup? According to Mill, he regarded democracy as necessary for progress. Why democracy? According to Mill, it permitted the citizens to use and develop their faculties fully. So when he talked about the freedom that should be given to individuals, the positive side of that freedom was that the individuals would be able to develop themselves fully. And democracy, according to Mill, provides them that opportunity to the fullest. So democracy is good, and democracy is good because it allows people to realize their own potential, and that realization makes people happier. So that exists and that is sorted. Now, his argument for representative democracy, a democracy in which there will be representative government, there will be people's representative who would be running the setup. And why is there? Because it, according to John Stuart Mill, serves the purpose of the government. What is the purpose of the government according to him? The purpose of the government according to him falls into two main sections. First, it must use the existing qualities and skills of the citizens to serve their interests. So the citizens with their already existing qualities and skills should be made to use those qualities and skills to the fullest, to the best for their own welfare, and that in turn would benefit the society at large. What else? The second head was that it must improve the moral, intellectual and active qualities of these citizens. So it should nurture the skills and the existing qualities in ideal government, and it should also improve moral, intellectual and active qualities. It should improve the people existing in a society morally, intellectually, and actively. They should become active. They should take part in the processes of the government. And according to J.S. Mill, it was only a representative democracy which will be able to fulfill both these requirements. Autocracy or a government which is run by a monarch would be able to fulfill the first purpose, or a despotic government would be able to fulfill, might be able to fulfill the first purpose, but the second purpose, in which the activity of the citizens need to be improved, need to be nurtured, is something that a despotic government cannot do, because it cannot allow people to become active participants in the governance process. And that is something that is provided by a representative democracy, and that is why a representative democracy is an ideal form of government according to J.S. Mill. So this is these are his thoughts about a government and what should an ideal government be like. And but that does not mean that he wholeheartedly supports and blindly lets people follow any democratic representative government. He also wants, in his work on liberty, which was composed in 1859, he asserts that he talks about a paradox. That's a contradiction, in which he talks about that the civil liberties are under a greater threat in democratic regimes than in despotic regimes. Why does he say so? Because he argues that in a despotic setup of government, the people are conscious that their civil liberties and their rights are being curtailed. So they are actively conscious of their rights being curtailed. While in a democratic setup, they think that the rulers are on their side and the people who are running the government are on their side, and that is why they that active consciousness of their civil liberties being curtailed is not there in a democratic setup. And that absence of active consciousness might be used by the democratic setup to curtail certain civil liberties, and people might not actually realize that their civil liberties have been curtailed or have been attacked upon in a democratic setup. So that is why he asserts that there is a need for constant vigilance, because and there is a need for constant activeness on behalf of the citizens, which is something very important for his ideal of a good government. He also, this is one thing that he does, where he qualifies and lays down a warning regarding a representative government, and there are certain other conditions that he puts up. The first condition obviously is that the citizens should remain active. They should be active participants in a democratic representative government. They should show their ability and willingness to preserve institutions of representative democracy. They should hold the institutions of representative democracy dear to themselves, and they should advocate liberal democracy, which specified and limited the powers of legally elected majorities by cataloging and protecting individual rights against majority. So this is the clause that he puts in order to save the democratic representative government from becoming a majoritarian government. He argues that the government should be, the people should be constantly vigilant, and they should, take certain steps to prevent the majority, the legally elected majority, to take over the rights of the individual. The individual is still very important, even if the government is run by a majority. And to further explain his point, he argues that if all mankind minus one person were of one opinion, so if entire majority of humankind is of one opinion and one person is of another opinion, then that majority or that mankind does not have the right to silence that one person and that one person does not have the right to silence that majority, the mankind at large. So this is the basis of his assertion of preventing majoritarianism in a democratic representative government, and that according to him is a better society. And he argues that only by constantly being able to refute wrong opinions that we would hold our correct opinions as living truths. So because there would be a conflict of opinions, there would be a majoritarian opinion, there would be a opinion of the individual, opinion of the minorities, and when there would be a constant argument between these two, constantly one would refute the other, then only the idea of truth can emerge. So this was his basic notion, in which this was his basic one of the recommendations, or one of the conditions that he put up, warnings that he gave regarding representative government. Another important thing that he did was he recommended an open ballot instead of a secret ballot. We know that Jeremy Bentham was a strong supporter of secret ballot, which is not the case with J.S. Mill. He argues that a secret ballot is important because, according to him, the idea is that the exercise of democracy, exercise of electing a government should be an open activity instead of being a closed activity, and he suggests that there should be an open ballot instead of a secret ballot. So these are basically his ideals regarding political setup, how a political state should be. And we need to assert again and again that he departed on very important grounds from Benthamian ideals. He departed from there, and another very important thing that we need to take into account here is that he also argued for state intervention on certain fronts. So now, before going into that, we need to understand that when we talk about liberal thought and liberal state, we need to understand that in the economic context, it means that the free market forces would govern the economy, and there would be no intervention on part of the state on the activities of the market. They would not be able to control it. But despite being from a liberal background and despite asserting liberal ideals, J.S. Mill claimed that there should be government intervention on certain fronts, and this is something, the control of the government and government intervention on certain fronts to protect the rights, or to protect the living standards, or to protect certain aspects, certain underprivileged sections of the society, is something that we would get to know about when we study socialism. So this is something that was there in J.S. Mill's thought as well, and he, despite staying within the framework of liberal thought, argued there can be certain intervention on part of the government, and these socialist ideals he received, and he gained respect for those socialist ideals because of the revolutions that took place in Europe in the 1840s, and the Irish famine that happened, and the efforts of the working men's organization that he saw in the 1870s. So all these events contributed to make John Stuart Mill more sympathetic towards socialist ideals, where he argued that on certain fronts the government should interfere in the functioning of a free market economy. This is more or less what we need to know about John Stuart Mill's thought. Another thing, he also talked about gender equality. We know that Jeremy Bentham as well argued for voting rights for women. He also pursued gender justice, and it is also the case with John Stuart Mill, who argued for gender equality, and giving equality to women, according to him, was a very important aspect in a society and in a good society. This is his political thought. We need to understand that even though he criticized Benthamian utilitarianism, he still classified himself as a utilitarian, and for him, when he argued about certain rights and certain liberties, like he talked about the right to choice, right to, you know, freedom. So those rights, according to him, were the utilities of the highest kind, because they were, according to him, these rights were nothing but utilities. They were nothing as extremely important utilities, according to John Stuart Mill. So this is a basic overview of what John Stuart Mill thought, and despite critiquing utilitarianism of Benthamian origin, he still called himself a utilitarian. And throughout his thought, we saw, and when his thought can be read, it would be seen that his entire thought was based on the idea of utility, where the utilitarian aspect of what is more useful and what is not is still there, but he has improved upon certain Benthamian ideals, where he has improved upon the mechanical and mechanized notion of pleasure and pain, and he has argued on a more diverse and a more subjective idea of pleasure and pain that is experienced by any human being. This is more or less what we need to know about the political ideas of John Stuart Mill.